Please don't shoot the messenger just because you don't like the message. I am not responsible for the conditions that we face as a nation today, but I am not going to sugarcoat what the situation is. My guess is you already know it in your hearts and in the backs of your minds, if not in the front. So I thought it might be useful if we took stock of where we are. And by taking stock, I mean economics above all else. That's a core part of our situation about which Americans are extraordinarily poorly informed. I do believe we are at a major transition point in the history of the United States and probably of the whole world. I know that sounds grandiose, and I don't normally talk in grandiose terms, but the situation calls for it. And as I say, I'm not going to shrink away from why I think this. So let me begin by telling you why I think it's such an important moment in our history. For most of the last 50 years, roughly since 1970, the dominant economic reality of the global economy and of the United States as the major player and shaper of that global economy in the last 50 years, that period can be characterized by many names, but the one that economists use is the phrase neoliberal globalization. And here's what it means, that in an era that we remember with names like Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher, we turned away from the legacy of the New Deal. We turned away, as did many other countries, from the notion that a catastrophe like the Great Depression of the 1930s required that government play a major role in keeping capitalism tolerable for the mass of people. Remember what we did in the 1930s. We established Social Security that had never existed before in the United States. We established a minimum wage that had never existed before in the United States. We established unemployment insurance that had never existed before in the United States. And the government hired and paid 15 million people who were unemployed, and nothing like that had ever happened in the United States either. The government was called in to do all these things, in the words of one clever thinker, to give capitalism a human face. And it was paid for because it was very expensive, as you can imagine. To give every elderly American a Social Security check every month for the rest of their lives. To give unemployed people a check every week for a year or two. To hire 15 million people. And the money that paid for all of that were heavy taxes placed on corporations and the rich. It's an important reminder for those of you who do not think that here in the United States we can ever tax corporations and the rich. It's an important reminder, of course we can, because we already did. As the remembrance or a footnote, the politician who had the courage to tax corporations and the rich, Franklin Roosevelt, was reelected president 3 consecutive times. He has been and is to this moment the most successful popular president in the history of the United States, starting with George Washington. So not only can you tax corporations and the rich, but when we had a president who was forced from below to do it, he became the most popular politician we've ever had. In the period starting in 1970, as the memory of the New Deal, as it was called, faded, Reagan and Thatcher undertook to roll the New Deal back. It had already begun before that, but it really gathered steam. And the mantra was the reverse of the New Deal. Instead of calling the government in to give capitalism a human face, people stumbled over one another, led by the Republicans, but tragically followed by the Democrats, to roll the government back, to get the government out of the economy, to go back to a capitalism which, if I may be allowed to continue the metaphor, lacks a human face, as the songs we just heard today document. And over the last 50 years, the government not only didn't regulate the way it once did, didn't intervene the way it once did, but it blessed the decision of corporate America to go where the profits were the greatest, which is what capitalism normally does. And where were profits the greatest? Answer: China. Starting in the 1970s, we had a mammoth exodus, and not like the one in the Bible. No, this was an exodus of American corporate leaders. They had graduated from business school where they had been taught, parentheses, I have taught in business schools myself, I know the curriculum. They were taught, if you want to succeed in business, go to where the wages are low and the market is expanding. The place where the wages were low and the market was expanding the most was in the land called the People's Republic of China. And American corporations, British and French and German and Italian and Japanese, they all went to China, where they were welcomed, where they were celebrated. And over the last 40 to 50 years, the Chinese economy grew. About half the economy there is capitalist. Private companies working pretty much the way they do here. The other half of the Chinese economy, government-owned and operated enterprises working the way they once did in places like the Soviet Union. China is a hybrid between the U.S. and the Soviet Union. Different from both because it's a mixed situation. And it turns out that under the leadership of the Chinese Mao Zedong and the ones that have come since him, it turns out this hybrid organization can grow faster than any other economic system the world has ever seen. For the last 30 years, China has grown its economy, its GDP, its gross domestic product, between 6 and 9% per year. During that time, the United States GDP grew between 2 and 3% a year. It doesn't take rocket science to understand that if you can manage that difference, if China can grow 2 to 3 times faster than the United States for 30 years, it can do what it has now done. Namely, it's caught up. Today, the United States has a competitor economically. We haven't had one for a century. World War II eliminated the potential competitors economically of the United States. Britain, France, Italy, Germany, and Japan, all destroyed by that war. Russia too. Russia never was an economic competitor. It isn't now either. The GDP of the United States right now is about $25 trillion. The GDP of Russia about now is 3, maybe 4 trillion. No contest. It never was. It's part of why the entire Cold War will have to be revisited so Americans can finally learn what the truth about all of this is. Well, here we are. And what has happened has been that the United States now faces, for the first time in a century, an economic competitor. Big, powerful, highly developed, and able to outcompete the United States across the board, from the lowest to the highest technology which either side is capable of. And the United States has not yet come to terms with this situation. The American people are engaged in what my psychotherapist wife explains to me is called denial. The pretense, mostly to yourself, that the reality around you isn't there. It's best understood when glimpsing a toddler confronted by a scary barking dog, and the toddler puts his or her hands in front of her eyes, comforted by the thought that if you can't see the dog, it isn't there. But we all know you grow up, and at a certain point, not many years later, you come to understand you can put your hand there, but it doesn't make the dog disappear. China's going nowhere. China is growing. By the way, lest you think any of this is in the past, let me give you right now what the rate of growth of economic output is for 2024. These I'm about to give you are the estimates of the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, which monitors all of this. Economic growth for the United States, 2024, 2.8%, right on target with what it's been on and off for a long time. The economic growth of People's Republic of China this year will be 4.8%, nearly double. And the economic growth of India will be 7%. The next time you hear an American politician or you read in an American newspaper how the American economy is doing better than anyone in the world, please remember the word denial. That kind of statement, which I encounter almost every day, is the exact equivalent of a toddler putting fingers in front of her eyes or nose in hoping that the scary dog will go away. Not only have the Chinese outgrown us, but they have built an alliance with other countries that are recognizing that what was true for the last 75 years, a global economy dominated by the United States as the country that came out of World War II with no bombs that fell on it other than Pearl Harbor, and less damage than any other developed country. The Chinese have built an alliance called the BRICS, B-R-I-C-S. You don't hear as much about it as you ought to. It started a few years ago, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, 5 countries. A year and a half ago, 6 more joined. And 3 weeks ago, 13 more joined. The BRICS together is more than half the population of this planet. The United States is 4.5%, not 50% of this planet. The total output of goods and services in the BRICS is significantly larger already than the total output of the United States and its major allies known as the G7. The United States, Canada, Japan, Britain, France, Germany, and Italy. So now every country in the world, every company in the world is reassessing and redesigning its strategy for the future. And what do I mean? They're redesigning because the dominant player in the world of the last 70 years, the United States, isn't the dominant player anymore. There is a bigger player, richer player in the BRICS, which means if you're going to build a railroad in your country, you don't just go to Washington or London or Paris. You may go to them, but you're going to ask them what offer they can make, and then you're going to compare it to what you can get from Beijing, New Delhi, and Sao Paulo. And in case after case, the choice is made to go with the BRICS, not the West. So what do I mean? I mean to tell you all that if you ask me to tell you what is the biggest reality we now have to face, it's the end of the American empire. What we inherited from the British, because they had the last empire before this one, is now over, and there is zero chance it's coming back. It ought to have been a central issue in the presidential election we just had. Instead, the two candidates and their parties worked overtime to practice denial. No such a thing. The war in Ukraine, just to take one of countless examples, will show you how costly this denial is. When the war begins in February of 2022, President Biden told us, along with all of his officials, Russia would be brought to its knees. The Russian currency, the ruble, would collapse. The entire West would side with Ukraine against the Russian invasion and would defeat the Russians. None of that happened. Every part of that prediction proved false. Why? Because the way Russia was to be brought to its knees was by denying the market for Russian oil and gas, whose export the Russians depend on. It's a major industry for them. And they exported all of that energy to Western Europe. When the Western Europeans, under pressure from the United States, closed their markets to Russia, the expectation was that Russia would collapse. Instead, Russia went to its allies in the BRICS, above all China and India, and arranged to sell to them the oil and gas they no longer sold to the Europeans. As a result, Russia is growing faster this year than the United States, and it has grown at a faster rate than the United States throughout the war. You couldn't be more mistaken than this. That's what it means if you deny a reality. What we know about the history of every other empire that also grew, was powerful, and then died was that the ride up as you're growing is a lot more fun and pleasant than the ride down when you're dying. The ride up was the 20th century, which many of you, like me, lived through. We now have to figure out how we descend when our empire is dying. What the United States is doing is typical. Denial has always been there. You can travel to Britain today and encounter no small number of people who still imagine that the British Empire is still there. Witness the inauguration ceremonies for King Charles, who's the king of nobody. What is this? Here's how it works in the United States. People who are rich and powerful are offloading the costs of a declining empire off of themselves. They don't want to suffer, which I understand. But if the economy is going down, which it is, and the people at the top are keeping theirs, which they are, then the rest of us, the middle class, the lower classes, the poor, we're going to be taking it on the chin more and more. And let me give you just a few of the examples. The inflation we just went through, that's a way of lowering the standard of living of large numbers of people, which they felt acutely as they went and paid $6 for a dozen eggs or everything else. They know they're suffering. My guess, no chance for Mr. Trump without that inflation. It gave him the victory, and it cost Kamala Harris the loss. But it's not the only thing. Let me give you other examples which an economist stares at with astonishment. The minimum wage at the federal level in the United States right now is $7.25 per hour, a sum of money on which nobody can live. When was the last time it was raised? 2009. That's 15 years ago. In every one of those 15 years, inflation raised the prices here in the United States of food, clothing, shelter, and everything else. Some years it went up a lot. Some years it went up only a little, but it went up. And what did we do to the people to whom we paid the lowest salary? $7.25. We didn't raise it. Republicans didn't raise it. Democrats didn't raise it. You know what that is? That's cruel and unusual punishment given to people whose crime is that they're poorly paid in the first place. What kind of a country does that? A declining empire whose rich and powerful are busy offloading the costs of that decline onto everybody else. Here's another sign. Our real wages have been stagnant for 30 to 40 years. In other words, if you measure, as we do in economics, the average wage in dollars paid to American workers, and you adjust that to the prices they have to pay when they spend their wages, it's been going up somewhere around 0.5% a year. That's called stagnation. That means your wage isn't going anywhere. By the way, in contrast, the average real wages in the People's Republic of China have quadrupled over the same 30 years. If you want to understand why the government in China is secure, why it is powerful, why economic growth there is celebrated, I just gave you the statistic. Their average wage quadrupled. The average wage in the United States went nowhere. That's not even close, friends. And if you didn't know that, since everything I'm telling you is easily verifiable in 1,000 government statistics, then you understand what I mean by denial. We are therefore experiencing in this country an extraordinary deepening of inequality. At the end of World War II, the United States was less unequal than European countries. Today, we are more unequal than every European country. How did that happen? Well, on the one hand, when corporations went to China and took advantage of low wages and a growing market, it made a fortune for those corporations and therefore for the top 10% of Americans who own shares. Just a footnote. The top 10% richest Americans own 80% of the stocks and bonds. They did well. The rest of us, we are experiencing a declining empire, which those at the top don't want you to think about. They're managing it quite well. We cannot. That inequality, together with the inflation, gives you Mr. Trump's victory and the bitterness and divisiveness that is suffusing this economy. And still, nobody willing to face these realities or to speak about them. Let me conclude by telling you that this is important to understand not only as our past and not even only as our present, as in the election we just had, but also in our future. This denial, this refusal to face the realities of the economy we have and that is shaping our lives and even more those of our children, promises us frightening near future. Mr. Trump won the election because he positioned himself with dramatic gestures, the sort favored by Madison Avenue advertisers. And the two gestures were, "I am the great protector." Mr. Trump understood, far better than the Democrats, that people feel attacked, undermined, frightened, scared, worried for themselves and their children, as well they should be. They glimpse fearfully where things are going. They want to be protected from it all. So he put himself forward as the great protector. And his two images were walls, the image of a protector. He's going to put a steel wall at the southern border to protect us against the invasion of the immigrants. And then he's going to put another wall, a tariff wall, to protect us against the evil Chinese. Very powerful images, very successful. But in terms of economics, total incoherent nonsense. It's impossible, and it's a bad joke. And the whole world is watching. And while it's watching this bad joke unfold, the gap between the United States and the G7 on one hand, and the People's Republic of China and the BRICS on the other, deepens. The United States' effort to stop, block, undercut China have failed. Been doing it now for 15 years. Started big time under Obama. It doesn't work. And so the question is, what? Do you keep doing it? When the United States' people wanted to become independent of George III, the dominant king of the great British Empire, it ended up in a war, the War of 1774, 5, and 6, our Independence War. And to the surprise of everybody, the British lost. In 1812, they tried again, and they lost again. After that, the British decided, okay, we'll have to work out an arrangement. And the United States arrangement was, you're independent, you can take Latin America. That was the Monroe Doctrine that happened a few years after that. And Britain took the rest. Asia, Africa was theirs. They avoided a war after that for a century. What will the United States do? Continue its denial of what's going on? Threaten, as they have, China with war, despite the fact that China has nuclear weapons and the Russians do too, and they are now allied in good part because of the United States? Or are we going to sit down and work something out? Are we going to tell the American people, honestly, our empire is declining? The next one looks to be Chinese. Or if it isn't Chinese, it's going to be a multinational replacement for the kind of dominance that the Persians or the Dutch or the British or the Americans operated. The world is changing very fundamentally. We are living, as I said a half hour ago, at a time of enormously profound change. And our job as Americans is to stop behaving childishly in this game of thinking that the problems I've barely sketched don't have to be worried about, because we can continue to act as if we were in charge in the way we were in the 1960s and 70s. We aren't. Nothing like that. The war in Ukraine is lost. For those of you who don't keep track, is over, except for signing the documents. Russia won, Ukraine and the West lost. The war in Gaza isolates the United States. Indeed, what historians will say when they look back on this time will be that the United States undertook to isolate and neutralize the dangers after World War II. First in the Soviet Union, then in China, then in the global socialist world, nowadays in what are euphemistically called authoritarian societies. But the end result of the plan to isolate the rest of the world going through these efforts was to isolate the United States itself. We and Israel are standing all alone in that part of the world. And the Europeans, whose world is collapsed, they're economically a basket case. And you know why? What the major reason is that Europe is gone as a player? Because they relied on two things: exporting to China, which the Chinese don't need, and cheap energy from Russia, which they have turned away from. So the energy costs make European production uncompetitive. They have to pay too much for energy, and they can't sell in China the way they once did. They're done. Germany, which used to be the engine of European growth, is now the laggard dragging it down. It really is extraordinary, folks, that what you have thought about and assumed is now over. And it takes courage, but also a sense of realism to say, now we are going to talk honestly about our situation and try to find a livable way forward. The alternative, well, I don't want to spell it out. You can figure it out for yourself. but I hope you will not hold against me that I have told you how this situation really is, rather than comforting you with more denial. In the early months, when Putin went to India, talked to Modi, and went to China and talked to Xi Jinping, and then I went, because I know how to do that, and I followed the oil and the gas trade. And where are the oil and gas lines being built? They had made a deal, and the deal was to move the oil and gas from Russia, sell it to China and India, and use the money to buy the products from India and China to replace those that they wouldn't buy from the West. They didn't have the dollars to do it with. And then you saw it, and it all came together. The Chinese have become the manufacturer of the world. And if it's not Chinese, it's Vietnamese or Bangladeshis. They will sell to Russia. There's no problem. They want that business. They'll sell to Russia. And they make everything. Russians are not going to be deprived of being unable to trade with Western Europe and America, because this is what Americans don't get. There's nothing made here that they don't make better and cheaper. I'll give you an example. Electric vehicles, electric car, electric truck. The best electric cars and trucks in the world right now, as we speak, are made in China. It is the world leader in electric cars and trucks. And that's the future of cars and trucks. Okay, the Chinese have the best and the cheapest. Okay, so the whole world is making the transition for reasons of pollution and climate change, but also for reasons of economizing on oil and gas. All of that, they're making the switch. Where are they going to buy it? They're going to buy it in China. Russia can re-equip its entire fleet by buying from China. With what? With the money they get from selling China the oil and gas. It'll run those cars that are still running on oil and gas, plus heat people's homes and make the electricity and all the rest. You can't play the way you did before. If you go to Cuba, they're driving cars made in the 50s. Cobbled together, cannibalized Jeep stuff. Why? Because they can't replace it. But the rest of the world is different. It's like telling Israel, you can't do settler colonialism now. You know that American men are in love with the pickup truck. You got to have boots, sort of like those normal boots, and a cowboy hat and a pickup truck, and you're a real man. Okay. Why is that? Is there something uniquely muscular about a pickup truck? No. Here's the reason. In the 1960s, the American car companies suddenly confronted real competition, which they hadn't for quite a while, mostly because of World War II. Ford, General Motors, Chrysler, competition. Where was it coming from? Europe. VW, Peugeot, Fiat, the producers there. They were coming back from the destruction of World War II, and they all understood they have to beat the United States because we were the hegemon. So they knew they had to produce a car that was better and cheaper. If they could do that, like the VW Bug, then they could break the market, because Americans were producing those boats on wheels, the old Chevy or the old silly car. Anyway, American Automobile Company went, punk, they're losing money. A deal was struck. End result of the deal, a tariff. The Europeans accepted a tariff on the truck. 25%, that's a lot in the car business. So any truck coming from Europe, pickup truck, you'd have to pay the price of that truck plus 25 cents to Uncle Sam as a tariff tax in order to bring it in. So they couldn't do it. It meant for the American car companies, which is why they pushed for it, freebie. You can now produce your truck. You could jack up the price by 20%, because that would still be less than they coming in having to pay 25%. But you would keep the profits yourself. So they did. And that's why they advertised trucks as manly symbols to every one of those 19-year-old wannabes who felt much larger and much more attractive to their potential girlfriend by having a truck. It had nothing to do with it. It was a deal. They advertised that because that was where the profit was, in a way that wasn't available on a sedan or a regular truck, etc., etc. Okay, what was the tariff until 6 months ago? What was the tariff on electric trucks and cars from China? 27.5% more. Biden 6 months ago raised it to 100%. If you go to Europe today, 1/4 of all the electric vehicles on the road in Europe are Chinese. If you go to the United States, not 1/4, 0. By the way, the biggest Chinese company, I'm going to ask you, you ever heard of it? Who makes cars and trucks? Is it a name like Chevy or Ford? BYD, 3 initials. It's the Colossus of China that makes electric vehicles. It's the largest seller of electric vehicles in Europe. It's not Tesla, it's them. They've outdone Tesla. Tesla's in China too, but BYD in China is the core company. This is a summary of all of what is going on. The United States is thereby, and that's the point, isolating itself. We are the place where there are no cheap electric vehicles. Why? We are the sufferers. I'll give you an example. Take a company A that makes whatever it is, shoes or camera equipment, doesn't matter. Any company in the United States making something. Take its competitor in Europe or Asia or Africa, who also makes that thing, and they both try to sell whatever that thing is in the world economy. The American company is going to have to, for reasons of law, and so switch to electric trucks and electric cars for their salespeople and to bring in their inputs, and they're going to have to pay more for the electric. Why? Because American companies they're doing with electric what they did with the pickup truck, charging a very high price. Try to go out and buy an electric car, you'll see. Price very high, unless you have one. You'll see quickly. Prices are high because they're artificially protected by the tariff. But the competitor doesn't have that problem. The European competitor who's making the same watch that you and I are thinking about buying for our boyfriends or girlfriends, we're going to get a better deal from the European because he's got cheaper inputs, like electric or American. So the American company that have nothing to do with electric vehicles is going to be hurt by this. They don't get this. Just like everybody understood that Russia and China could buy all the gas and oil Russia can produce for the next 50 years. Do we really want to develop that business? Because when the war in Ukraine is over, the Russians might decide we're not going to sell to Europe. Why should we risk them doing that to us again? We're going with our new buddies. By the way, that's where they're building the pipelines, which will be another big argument to stay with that. They've invested enormous amounts of money in building pipelines from Russia into India and into China. There were some already. They've expanded all. You're cementing in the isolation of the United States. China's official self-definition, mainland China, is socialism with Chinese characteristics. That's what they call their society, and they have for many years. By the way, no country called itself communist. It's the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. Not communism was the name of the party that fought for socialism. That's been true everywhere. Only in the United States, where socialists and communists are just synonyms. They're communist Russia, communist China. The Russians never called their society communist, and the Chinese never did either. None of them. Mao didn't, Lenin didn't, none of them. They called themselves socialists. Socialism was what comes after, in their view, capitalism. The goal of socialism is to go much further to something called communism. The leader of Spain right now, a man named Pedro Sanchez, is the head of something called the Socialist Party of Spain. The largest block of seats in the French National Assembly is now in the hands of a party called the New Popular Front. The leader of that, a man named Jean-Luc Mélenchon. His party has the most seats. He was in the Communist Party of France. He left it and became part of the Socialist Party of France. He now runs the party called France Unbowed. That's part of the New Front Populaire. And he's the de facto leader in France. He's a socialist. All of that makes perfect sense in French politics because there's a socialist party and separately a communist party, and they don't get along. And they haven't for a long time. Why? Because in many French families, there are people who are socialists and people who are communists and people who are neither. And they all get together on a picnic at the park at the same time. That's normal in a lot of European Americans can't get their heads around, right? Europeans have all been connected in one way or another to socialists and communists. The métro, it's a wonderful system in Paris, really gets you around everywhere. Everybody uses it. It is unionized, has been for decades. And that union is closely affiliated with the Communist Party. You got on a train driven by a communist, cleaned by a communist. You're an American tourist. You had no idea your life was in the hands of all these communists. For some people, socialism is very minimally understood. And here I'm going to put together Scandinavians, Western Europeans, Bernie Sanders, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. What? They're socialists. They all accept and don't run away from the label socialist. What do they mean? They mean a society in which factories, offices, and stores, businesses in short, enterprises, are owned and operated privately, in which employers, a small minority, hire most people as employees to work in the factories, offices, and stores. Why is that not the United States or Britain, which they would call capitalist? Their answer is because we want the government to intervene massively to soften the hard edges of capitalism. Capitalists like to get away with paying very low wages to their employees. That makes the employees' lives difficult. We are in favor of minimum wages, a law which says you cannot pay that person what you're paying him now. That's not enough. There's a floor. You go below the floor, we're going to arrest you. You can't do it. For example, as a perennial problem, the growers in California want to hire immigrants from Mexico to work for nothing, or as close to nothing as they can get it. And then this constant issue, and with grapes, remember for years there was grape boycotts, all of that. Those grapes were picked that way, and wine is a big deal in California. All right, but the socialists disagree on how much government intervention there should be. So, for example, there are socialists who think it's appropriate to tax corporations and the rich, but not more than you tax others. And there are others who say, are you crazy? The tax should be progressive. In other words, the richer you are, the higher the percentage of your wealth you should pay. Okay, that's a bigger intervention. Let me take it another step. There are socialists who say we have to have an office of safety and health. Corporations are constantly shortcutting, protecting their workers from too much heat or bad air or shitty water or whatever. And so the government has to come in and monitor and control and regulate. There's a whole school of socialism that understands there are different kinds of socialism depending on how far into the economy the government is supposed to go to take away its hard edges. Should the government give everybody a free education? Should the government give everybody free medical care? By the way, in France, the university is free. In Germany, the university is free. Undergraduate and graduate, Americans need to hear it. It's been that way a long time. My French family, when a child is born, they're covered by a medical insurance, as is the birth, and they are covered until they die. I've been a visiting professor at the University of Paris, and when I got my little certificate, it said on it, this is a certificate for your medical. When I had a couple of things, I strep throat or something, I went to the medical system, gave them my card, and that's it. They took care of me. You don't pay. The doctors explained that to me. We're on salary. We don't depend on how many of you come in here. By the way, there was nobody in the office except the doctor. They don't need a clerk. They take my card, stick it in a computer, and there everything there is, and they type in what it is, what's wrong with me, what medication they prescribe, and so forth. Then they said you have to have a lab test to go down the street, gave them the same card. No one ever billed me. No one ever asked a nickel from it, nothing. But as he explained to me, he says, it's not like your system. We don't have to charge you. We don't need half the money you guys do, because we're not paying 400 secretaries and technicians. None of that happens here. If you do Western European socialism, or you listen to Bernie gives you idea. I want to tax billionaires, and I want to control. There should be a minimum wage. That's this guy. We should have national health for everybody. You know what he's doing? He's proposing that the modest levels of support you get in this country be raised to the much more generous levels of support you have in Europe. By the way, most of the rest of the world is in between. More than the United States, less than in Western Europe. Many countries have communist parties, many countries don't. Socialist parties you see almost everywhere. Even the United States has always had a social, even though it's very small, except at the beginning of the 20th century when it became big. 1912, 1916, 1924. That period, You had a major union leader, Eugene Victor Debs, head of the Railway Workers Union in this country, leader of the American Socialist Party. He was in prison as the head of the Socialist Party when he ran and got 1 million votes in this country. So when people tell you socialism can never be in the United States, it's again ignorance talking. He was in prison because as head of the Socialist Party, at the outbreak of World War I, he went around the country, because there was no radio or television yet, giving speeches urging American workers not to participate in the war, on the argument this is a war among capitalists who are fighting to grab hold of the world. No working man should be killing other working men for that. For that, he was arrested and put in jail. Several leaders around the world reacted to World War I with the same words. One of them was Vladimir Lenin, who had to leave Russia because the alternative would have been he would have been in prison. He left and went to live in Zurich, Switzerland.